Welcome. Today's story takes us deep into the shadows of 1847 Georgia, where power, secrecy, and forbidden desire collided in a way that still disturbs historians. This is not a legend or rumor, but a carefully researched true account pulled from letters, court whispers, and plantation records. As you listen, tell me where you're watching from, and if you value stories uncovered through long hours of real historical digging, subscribe, because bringing truth out of silence takes serious work, and this story was meant to be heard. In 1847, Georgia was a land built on silence, hierarchy, and fear. Vast plantations stretched across the countryside, their beauty hiding a brutal truth beneath. White, columned houses stood proudly over fields worked from dawn to night by enslaved black men and women whose lives were owned, counted, and controlled like property. The plantation was not just a place of labor. It was a closed world with its own laws, where the will of the owner outweighed morality, justice, and even human life. At the heart of this system stood absolute power. Plantation owners controlled marriages, families, movement, and punishment. Enslaved people could be sold away from their children without warning. Love had no legal protection, and resistance often meant the whip, the chain, or worse. Overseers enforced discipline with cruelty, while neighbors rarely questioned what happened behind the gates. What mattered was profit, obedience, and maintaining appearances in a society obsessed with order. Women of wealthy plantation families occupied a strange position within this world. Though restricted by patriarchal norms, white women of status still wielded terrifying authority over the enslaved. They could command labor, order punishment, and influence life or death decisions. When men were absent or dead, women could become full controllers of estates, an uncommon but powerful role that blurred traditional expectations and placed them above the law of conscience. Religion was used to justify everything. Sermons preached obedience, telling the enslaved their suffering was divinely ordained. Plantation owners convinced themselves they were benevolent caretakers, even as they broke families apart and erased identities. Churches, courts, and communities often turned a blind eye, reinforcing the idea that slavery was not only legal, but righteous. This spiritual manipulation deepened the silence and crushed hope. Privacy on plantations was an illusion for the enslaved. Cabins were watched, conversations overheard, and bodies monitored. Yet secrets still existed, hidden in stolen glances, whispered words, and nighttime meetings under the cover of darkness. These fragile moments of humanity were acts of quiet rebellion, dangerous but necessary for survival. In such an environment, any forbidden relationship was not just scandalous, it was life-threatening. This was the world in which the Georgia twins lived and ruled. A society where power erased boundaries, where ownership distorted desire, and where the unthinkable could happen because no one dared to speak. To understand their story, one must first understand this dark ecosystem, because in 1847 Georgia, cruelty was ordinary, silence was safety, and secrets were buried deeper than the soil itself. The twin sisters stood as rare figures in the rigid world of 1847 Georgia, two women bound not only by blood, but by absolute control over a plantation and the lives within it. In a society dominated by men, their position was unusual and unsettling. Whether through inheritance, the absence of male guardians, or family tragedy, Authority had fallen into their hands, and with it came power that few women of the era ever possessed. They ruled together, speaking with one voice and enforcing decisions as a unit. Enslaved workers quickly learned that there was no appeal from one sister to the other. What one commanded, the other upheld. This shared dominance created an atmosphere of confusion and fear, as no cracks existed in their leadership. Unity made them stronger, and silence made them untouchable. Outwardly, they were respected Southern women, well-dressed, well-spoken, and welcomed in polite society. Neighbors saw refinement, not control. Guests admired the order of the estate, never questioning the cost of that order. Behind closed doors, however, their authority extended into every private corner of plantation life, including labor assignments, punishments, and intimate boundaries that should never have been crossed. Their closeness intensified everything. Twins often shared thoughts, secrets, and emotions, but in this case, it also meant shared moral blindness. What might have troubled one conscience was normalized by the other. Desire, power, and justification fed into a closed loop where nothing felt forbidden anymore, only hidden. Together, they redefined what was acceptable within their domain. The enslaved men under their control were trapped in this imbalance. Refusal was impossible. Consent had no meaning where ownership existed. Any personal attention from the sisters was layered with fear, survival instinct, and the constant threat of punishment. The twins' authority transformed personal relationships into instruments of dominance, blurring lines between command and coercion. In 1847 Georgia, no law truly limited what plantation owners could do in private. The twin sisters understood this well. Their shared authority became a shield, protecting secrets, silencing witnesses, and allowing a forbidden reality to exist beneath a polished surface. What followed was not sudden madness, but the slow, dangerous result of unchecked power multiplied by 2. For the enslaved men living on Georgia plantations in 1847, life was defined by restriction and terror. The law did not recognize them as human beings, but as movable property, assets that could be bought, sold, punished, or destroyed without consequence. Their bodies belonged to others, their labor was demanded without rest, and their futures could vanish with the stroke of a pen. Every sunrise meant survival, every mistake could mean violence. Fear governed every action. A wrong look, a delayed response, or a whispered word could result in public punishment meant to serve as a warning to others. Whippings were not hidden, they were spectacles. Shackles, isolation, and forced labor were tools used to break the spirit as much as the body. In this environment, obedience was not loyalty, it was self-preservation. The law offered no refuge. Enslaved men could not testify against white owners in court. They could not legally marry, protect their children, or claim abuse. Even clear acts of cruelty were dismissed as discipline. Escape was nearly impossible, and failure meant torture or death. The legal system itself was a cage, reinforced by patrols, informants, and neighbors eager to collect rewards. Psychological control was just as powerful as physical force. Enslaved men were taught from childhood that resistance was hopeless. Constant surveillance erased privacy, while uncertainty kept fear alive. Families were used as leverage, threats of sale or separation ensured silence. Love became dangerous, trust became rare, and hope was treated like a weakness. Within this terror, any personal attention from an owner carried deadly complexity. What might appear as favor or protection from the outside was often another form of control. Refusal was unthinkable. Consent did not exist where punishment was guaranteed. Enslaved men learned to survive by reading moods, suppressing emotions, and enduring what could not be stopped. This was the reality faced by the men bound to the Georgia twins. Their lives were already owned before any forbidden bond began. Understanding this fear is essential because in 1847, no choice made under chains could ever be free. In the suffocating world of a Georgia plantation, emotion itself was dangerous. For the enslaved men, forming any personal attachment beyond survival carried risk, yet the human need for connection never fully died. Under constant control, even a moment of kindness, or the illusion of it, could feel powerful. This is where the forbidden bond began, not as romance, but as a fragile psychological entanglement shaped by fear, dependence, and imbalance. For the twin sisters' authority had long blurred the line between command and intimacy. Accustomed to obedience, they were surrounded by people who could not refuse them. Over time, attention turned personal. Words lingered longer. Glances held meaning. What should have been distant became familiar, and familiarity quietly crossed into possession of a different kind, emotional ownership layered on top of legal ownership. For the enslaved men, the situation was a trap with no exit. Any display of warmth from an owner could mean temporary protection from punishment or sale. Survival demanded careful response, never too cold, never too eager. Emotions were suppressed, reshaped, and performed as needed. What outsiders might later misinterpret as affection was, in reality, a complex survival instinct formed under pressure. The secrecy intensified everything. Meetings happened in silence, away from watchful eyes, often at night or in isolated corners of the estate. The danger of discovery added tension, turning every interaction into a risk. Rumors could destroy lives. A single witness could trigger brutal consequences. Fear didn't stop the bond, it tightened it. For the sisters, secrecy became thrilling and validating. Their shared confidence reinforced the belief that what they were doing was justified, even inevitable. In their closed world, desire overpowered morality. They convinced themselves that silence equaled consent, ignoring the chains that made refusal impossible. This forbidden emotional bond was not love. It was a distortion created by power, silence, and fear. It grew in the dark soil of slavery, where human emotions were twisted into tools of control. And once such a bond existed, the line between secrecy and scandal became dangerously thin. In 1847 Georgia, marriage between a white person and an enslaved black person was not just forbidden, it was legally impossible. The law refused to recognize enslaved people as capable of consent, contract, or family. Any such union threatened the entire foundation of slavery, which depended on absolute racial and legal separation. To cross that line was to defy not only society, but the system itself. Yet behind closed doors, the twins pushed past that boundary. What began as secrecy evolved into something more deliberate, private vows spoken without witnesses, ministers, or records. These were not marriages protected by law or faith, but symbolic acts carried out in silence. To the sisters, these vows may have felt binding and meaningful. To the enslaved men, they were perilous gestures performed under ownership, where refusal was never a real option. The secrecy was meticulous. No papers were signed. No community rituals took place. Any acknowledgement of the unions existed only within the plantation's hidden world. Trusted servants were silenced through fear. Outsiders were kept distant. The twins understood that discovery would mean disgrace, legal ruin, and violent retaliation against the men involved. For the enslaved men, these so-called marriages offered no protection. They did not change legal status, prevent punishment, or secure freedom. At any moment, the illusion could shatter. The men remained property, subject to sale, separation, or death, despite the private vows exchanged. What looked like commitment was, in reality, another layer of control masked as intimacy. The twins justified their actions by rewriting reality. In their minds, secrecy transformed wrongdoing into something sacred. They convinced themselves that because no one knew, no harm was done. But the danger was constant. A whispered rumor, a jealous observer, or a moment of defiance could unravel everything. These secret marriages were acts of contradiction, intimate yet coercive, symbolic yet powerless. They exposed the deep hypocrisy of a society that allowed ownership of human beings, but condemned relationships that challenged racial hierarchy. And once the line had been crossed, there was no turning back, only deeper secrecy and greater risk. In 1847 Georgia, secrecy was not safety, it was a temporary delay of catastrophe. Every hidden act carried the constant threat of discovery, and on a plantation eyes were everywhere. Overseers, neighbors, visiting relatives, and even rival enslaved workers, anyone could notice a pattern, a favor, or a privilege that did not belong. Rumors traveled faster than truth, and once whispered, they could never be fully erased. For the twin sisters, exposure meant social death. Southern society demanded absolute racial boundaries, and violation of those boundaries brought disgrace that no wealth could fully repair. Their family name, inheritance, and standing would collapse overnight. Courts might intervene, churches would condemn them, and relatives could seize control of the estate. Fear forced the sisters into tighter control, harsher discipline, and deeper lies. For the enslaved men, the consequences were far more severe. Discovery could lead to brutal punishment meant to erase evidence and send a warning. Whippings, iron restraints, forced sale to distant plantations, or even death were real possibilities. They had no legal defense, no voice, and no protection. If blame was assigned, it would fall entirely on them, regardless of who held power. This fear reshaped daily life. Movements were watched more closely. Interactions became colder in public and more desperate in private. Silence was enforced through intimidation. Any enslaved person suspected of knowing too much could be punished. As a precaution, fear became a management tool, spreading control across the entire plantation. The psychological toll was immense. Living under constant threat eroded trust and stability. Sleep was broken by anxiety. Every sound at night carried danger. The sisters themselves became prisoners of their secret, forced to balance desire against self-preservation. What once felt thrilling turned into paranoia. In this world, exposure was not just about truth, it was about power. The system was designed to protect owners and destroy the owned. The secret could never be shared safely, only buried deeper. And as fear grew, It pushed everyone involved toward choices that would leave lasting damage. Long after the secret itself was gone, the story of the Georgia twins is not just one of secrecy. It is a study in the dangerous collision of absolute power and distorted morality. In 1847, the twins wielded authority that allowed them to bend lives to their will. Their status as wealthy white women gave them societal privilege, while the law rendered the enslaved men powerless. In this environment, the line between personal desire and exploitation became blurred, creating a profound moral contradiction. On one hand, the twins were capable of affection and seemingly intimate connections. On the other, these connections were imposed on people who had no legal or social right to refuse. Every act of desire carried the weight of coercion, whether consciously acknowledged or not. What might have appeared as mutual attachment from the outside was fundamentally unbalanced, a relationship where power dictated terms and shaped emotions. The enslaved men were trapped in a paradox. Any compliance could be interpreted as consent, while resistance risked punishment. Their emotions, choices, and even survival were manipulated. This imbalance made every interaction morally complex, as the humans who were owned could never truly consent, yet could still experience vulnerability, affection, or longing. The sisters themselves were caught in their own moral blindness. Growing up in a society built on slavery, their understanding of right and wrong was shaped by law, custom, and privilege. The secrecy of their unions allowed them to rationalize actions that were otherwise socially and ethically forbidden. In their minds, hidden desire equaled acceptable behavior. This contradiction extended beyond the immediate relationships. It rippled across the plantation, affecting other enslaved individuals who were forced to witness, participate in, or cover up what was happening. It challenged the very structure of morality that society claimed to uphold, revealing the deep hypocrisy at the heart of Southern power structures. In the end, the story of the twins illustrates a chilling truth: power can warp morality, and privilege can obscure conscience. In the microcosm of the plantation, desire, ownership, and secrecy combined to create a reality where ethical boundaries were irrelevant and humanity was measured by control rather than compassion. On the Georgia plantation, secrecy depended not only on fear but on clever concealment. The twins' forbidden actions could not exist in isolation. They relied on silence, discretion, and a network of hidden witnesses who understood the stakes. Trusted servants and house staff became invisible allies, observing and guarding secrets that could destroy lives if revealed. Their complicity was not voluntary in the full sense. It was enforced through fear, survival instincts, and subtle manipulation. Communication had to be coded. Letters between the sisters or between them and outsiders contained hidden meanings, cryptic phrases, or careful omissions. Even a simple word could betray the truth if misread. These coded correspondences allowed the twins to plan, discuss, and rationalize their forbidden unions without alerting neighbors, relatives, or visiting officials. The letters themselves became instruments of secrecy, evidence of desire carefully disguised as mundane housekeeping or plantation management. Hidden witnesses existed in the shadows of the estate, watching interactions that were both ordinary and charged with tension. A glance, a gesture, or a momentary smile could be interpreted differently depending on context. Those who saw too much risked punishment, but some acted as silent chroniclers, preserving fragments of history in whispered memory or discreet record. Their observations created a web of knowledge that was invisible to outsiders, but critical to maintaining secrecy. The need for coded communication and hidden witnesses intensified paranoia. Every action, every step outside the cabin, carried potential consequences. The twins monitored these networks meticulously, aware that a single slip could unravel years of careful concealment. For the enslaved men, every letter, every glance, every whispered word was a negotiation between survival and forced complicity. In this environment, secrecy became both strategy and prison. It protected forbidden acts while simultaneously magnifying fear, tension, and psychological strain. The twins' cunning in maintaining this hidden world demonstrates how power can manipulate information, control perception, and enforce silence, transforming a private scandal into a shadowed ecosystem of obedience and danger. Even in a tightly controlled plantation, secrets rarely remain completely hidden. The Georgia twins' forbidden unions existed in a delicate balance, constantly threatened by the eyes and ears of the surrounding community. Rumors began to stir, small whispers carried on the wind, half-heard stories told in passing by neighboring workers or traveling merchants. Yet, despite suspicion, most people chose silence. Speaking out risked social backlash, legal trouble, or being drawn into the dangerous affairs of a powerful family. Neighbors, clergy, and even relatives often participated in a form of silent complicity. They might notice privileges extended to certain enslaved men or unusual behavior among the twins. But they looked the other way. Social norms and fear of scandal created a collective self-censorship. To question the twins directly could result in ostracism or confrontation, while spreading gossip risked igniting violence or retribution. Silence became a protective tool for the community, even as it enabled wrongdoing to continue unchecked. The rumors that circulated were fragmentary, often contradictory, and fueled by imagination as much as observation. Some saw the twins as eccentric but harmless. Others whispered of impropriety, of blurred boundaries, and of the unnatural power they exercised. These stories, incomplete yet persistent, added pressure to the already tense environment, making every action on the plantation feel more precarious. For the enslaved men, community complicity was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it offered a thin veil of protection. Others' silence kept them from immediate exposure. On the other, it was an unspoken reminder that any misstep could be fatal. They lived in a world where human connection, observation, and rumor were all weapons in the hands of those with social leverage. The combination of rumor and silent complicity highlights the broader moral corruption of 1847 Georgia. A society that allowed slavery, enforced rigid racial hierarchies, and rewarded obedience inevitably created conditions where forbidden acts could occur under the nose of everyone. Visible to all, acknowledged by none. The twins' story thrived in this shadowy ecosystem, shielded as much by societal fear as by secrecy itself. In 1847 Georgia, the law was clear. Enslaved people could not legally marry, and any attempt to form such a union was considered null and void. The legal system treated enslaved men and women as property, denying them the rights, protections, or recognition that free citizens enjoyed. Any so-called marriage between a white woman and an enslaved man was not only socially scandalous, but criminal in the eyes of the state. The twins' actions therefore existed entirely outside the law, in a gray zone that was both dangerous and forbidden. This legal impossibility intensified the stakes of secrecy. Even private ceremonies held no legitimacy. They could not protect the enslaved men from sale, punishment, or exploitation. Any claim of union had no standing in court, no recognition by clergy, and no societal acknowledgement. To outsiders, these marriages were invisible, illegal, and meaningless, but to those within the plantation walls, they carried immense personal significance, complicated by fear and coercion. The law's absolute authority reinforced power dynamics. The twins understood that breaking these legal boundaries could result in public scandal, confiscation of property, and intervention by authorities. For the enslaved men, the impossibility of legal recognition meant that their lives, families, and futures remained entirely at the mercy of the twins' will. Consent could not exist under such conditions. Legality and morality were entirely separate from the reality imposed on the plantation. Moreover, the legal system's inability to protect the enslaved men reflected the broader societal hypocrisy of the time. Southern law upheld racial hierarchy and property rights over human life, while moral condemnation remained selective, aimed more at the scandal of breaking racial norms than at addressing exploitation. The twins' unions, therefore, were illegal not because they harmed themselves, but because they challenged the rigid racial and social order. The legal impossibility of these unions highlights the stark contrast between human emotion and systemic oppression. Desire, secrecy, and survival collided with laws designed to erase agency, creating a dangerous tension that could explode at any moment. Within this fragile and illicit framework, the twins' story becomes a chilling example of how power, law, and morality intersected in the darkest corners of 1847 Georgia. The relationships between the Georgia twins and the enslaved men were not simple matters of love or desire. They were tangled in layers of psychological control. In a world where the enslaved were considered property, affection could not exist in a vacuum. Every gesture, every word of kindness was entwined with power, obedience, and the constant threat of punishment. What outsiders might perceive as warmth or intimacy was in fact a subtle form of manipulation, carefully calibrated to reinforce dominance. The twins wielded psychological control like an invisible chain. Small privileges, a private conversation, a brief reprieve from labor, a moment of attention, became tools to shape behavior. Compliance was rewarded not with freedom, but with fleeting safety or emotional reinforcement. The men learned quickly to navigate this perilous terrain, offering gestures or responses that could signal cooperation without inviting danger. Survival depended on decoding the sisters' moods, anticipating desires, and suppressing personal will. Yet within this control, something resembling affection could emerge. Human beings, even under coercion, are capable of emotional responses. For the twins, attachment to the men might have felt real, genuine, or even tender. But it was always inseparable from authority. The line between caring and commanding was permanently blurred, creating relationships that were simultaneously intimate and oppressive, comforting and terrifying. For the enslaved men, This duality was psychologically exhausting. They were constantly balancing instinctive human responses with the harsh reality of power imbalance. Love or trust became dangerous commodities, vulnerable to betrayal, exposure, or punishment. Even moments of perceived tenderness could mask danger, and survival required perpetual vigilance. This tension between affection and control, desire and dominance, is at the heart of the disturbing story. It illustrates how power can warp human relationships, turning acts of intimacy into instruments of psychological domination. In the Georgia twins' Plantation, love and coercion were inseparable, leaving a legacy of confusion, fear, and moral ambiguity that haunts history. The story of the Georgia twins and their enslaved husbands did not vanish with time. It left a legacy that continues to haunt historians and readers alike. Though it was hidden from public records and largely ignored by contemporary society, the tale serves as a stark illustration of the moral contradictions, power imbalances, and human suffering embedded in the institution of slavery. It reminds us that history is not only made of laws and dates, but of secret lives, forbidden acts, and the consequences of unchecked authority. For generations, the events on that plantation were whispered in silence, remembered only in fragments passed down through families or uncovered in obscure letters, diaries, and legal documents. These remnants reveal the human complexity behind the facts: women exercising unusual power, men navigating survival under coercion, and a society structured to hide, deny, or justify such transgressions. The story exposes the fragility of morality when it clashes with privilege and fear. Historians studying the case must grapple with uncomfortable truths. The twins' actions cannot be neatly categorized as love, cruelty, or desire. They were all three simultaneously, filtered through a system designed to dehumanize some while empowering others. This ambiguity challenges modern assumptions about consent, agency, and morality, forcing reflection on how societal structures shape personal relationships. Beyond historical analysis, the tale resonates culturally. It serves as a chilling reminder of how secrecy, power, and coercion can distort human bonds, creating situations where survival, emotion, and ethics collide in impossible ways. The story continues to spark debate, curiosity, and reflection on how history records and sometimes conceals the truths of human experience. Ultimately, the legacy of the Georgia twins is a testament to the dark intersections of power, secrecy, and desire. It is a story that forces us to confront the uncomfortable realities of the past, to question what we know about morality under oppression, and to remember the human cost hidden beneath the surface of history. Even decades later, it continues to disturb, intrigue, and teach lessons about the complexity of human behavior in a world ruled by fear and inequality.